Good morning and welcome. I'm Matt Robinson with the Paragon Health Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to today's virtual event, No Cell, Bell to Bell, the case for full day smartphone bans in school. If you are a parent or a teacher or a student, you know this issue well. You've seen kids with their heads down and their phones up in the hallways, at lunch, and yes, in the classroom. You watch teachers and even your child's friends compete for attention against Silicon Valley's powerful algorithms engineered to enthrall. If you're on this call, you've worried, as so many of us have, about what all of this is doing to our children's ability to learn, to connect, to grow, and to thrive. That's exactly why Paragon commissioned this research as part of our Public Health and American Well-Being Initiative. We believe the wise use of technology is one of the most important health challenges of our time. So I'm proud to report that the paper you'll hear about today, Banning Smartphones in Schools, Full Day Bans Associated with Best Outcomes for Students, has become one of the most widely read and shared research papers in Paragon's history. That kind of response tells you something. This issue strikes a nerve because it matters to families, educators, and policymakers across the country. Now, a word about today's conversation. As always, Paragon starts with rigorous research. First, we'll hear from the two scholars who wrote the paper. They'll walk us through how they came to take on this question, what the evidence actually shows, and why they believe the findings carry such significant implications for students and schools. Then we'll turn to two thoughtful and energetic state legislators who are putting these findings into practice. Senator Chase Blasey, the majority leader of the Kansas Senate, and Senator Jeff Rotz, who represents Indiana's District 27. They will tell us how the research is shaping policy on the ground in their states. But first, let me introduce our researchers. Dr. Timothy Presley is an associate professor of psychology at Christopher Newport University, where he is also a faculty member in the university's Masters in Teaching program and the Center for Education Research and Policy. He earned his PhD in educational psychology from Florida State University and brings a uniquely grounded perspective to this work because before he was a researcher, he was an elementary school teacher. This classroom experience is the driving force behind his scholarship. His work has been published in leading journals, including Educational Researcher and Teaching and Teacher Education, and he is the co-author with David Marshall of Pandemic Lessons, Disruption, Innovation, and What Schools Need to Move Forward. Dr. David Marshall is an associate professor of educational research at Auburn University's College of Education. Like Dr. Presley, he came to research through the classroom, beginning his career as a middle and high school social studies teacher in both traditional public schools and public charter schools in Philadelphia. He went on to spend 7 years working with teacher residency programs in Virginia, and his research spans teacher preparation, school choice, and the effects of technology on student learning. He recently served 2 terms as the chair of the Alabama Public Charter School Commission and currently serves on the board of directors for Breakthrough Charter School. He also serves on the editorial boards of 3 peer-reviewed journals. Together, these scholars bring rigorous research, practical experience, and a genuine commitment to education and learning. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Matt. So David and I's research really has focused on the well-being of teachers and their burnout and trying to best retain teachers. And so one of the big questions we had was, how is this new cell phone ban policy going to impact teachers? We know the main reason for these cell phones is to better support students, and we fully agree with that reasoning. But we also understand that teachers have a lot on their plate. And so we wanted to see how teachers were feeling about this new cell phone ban. And so we started this by looking at a small division in Virginia and talking to middle school and high school teachers, which David will talk more about here in a little bit. But that was really kind of our starting point. And from that study, it's kind of grown of, all right, what is the overall impact of this new policy that we're seeing sweeping across the United States? So I'm going to hand it off to David here to talk about the different types of bans that we're seeing across the United States and some of the advantages of each type of ban.
All right. Again, thanks for having us this morning. Excited to be here. Um, Basically, the policies that have been enacted around cell phones in K-12 schools across the country, they vary across contexts, but we would argue that there are three large main buckets of policies. We have bell-to-bell policies, instructional time bans, and then more targeted bans. Um, but as with any policy, there are trade-offs, and in this case, the trade-offs come in terms of impact that they have. At least what we've seen so far in the research and the literature, the costs associated with them, and the feasibility of implementing these. The most comprehensive by far policy is the bell-to-bell ban, and this is where schools are prohibited from arrival at school all the way to dismissal. There's no phones throughout the school day, and this takes about two or three different forms in general. You sometimes you have some schools have invested in yonder pouches where students put their phones physically in these pouches. They're locked. They can't be necessarily open throughout the day. There's other schools that have collect phones at the beginning of the day, say an advisory, and they don't give them back till the last 5 minutes or 10 minutes of the school day. Then there's other schools, including the one I'm going to talk about, that there's a school district in Virginia. The way they handle it is just understood. You can have your phone, it can be off, it just needs to be out of sight. You cannot be seen with it, you cannot use it throughout the school day. The bell to bell, we would argue what we've found is the most effective approach at reducing distractions, improving classroom conditions. The best outcomes we have found are associated with bell to bell. There's fewer disruptions, tends to be linked to stronger engagement. However, it also is often, maybe not as popular up front, especially with teachers or especially with students and parents. Teachers tend to like it. It's the most demanding policy. There are infrastructure costs if you're going to invest in pouches or you're going to invest in some sort of storage or lockers associated with it. You have staffing supervision that needs to be enacting and implementing it as well. We would argue if the goal is maximum impact, bell-to-bell bans are probably the way to go. The highest clarity, highest impact, but it's not low effort. So we would say that. Instructional time bans are generally speaking, this is where phones are prohibited during class. They're maybe allowed at other times during uh, between classes in the hallway, during lunch, things of that nature. It's generally the most widely supported upfront approach from parents and the public. It's easier to implement. There's generally no infrastructure investment that needs to be made. It still addresses classroom disruption, instructional time loss, but the benefits tend to be a little more limited because phones are still present throughout the school day. You're not getting rid of the distraction. And this ends up falling heavily on teachers in terms of actually consistently enforcing these. And this can be inconsistent across classrooms. So what we would say is that this is probably, from a policy standpoint, the most practical starting point. But the expectations of enforcement often do fall on teachers. So it's easier to pass and get through. It's harder to enforce. That's what we would say. And the third major bucket is sort of more targeted restrictions, and this is where phones are restricted in specific contexts rather. So this might be, teacher discretion, for example, maybe not during testing, things of that nature. These types of bans can solve. These are, I think, of all the policies that have been enacted, these are the rarest. They might solve specific problems like test security, things like that. This is kind of what was already in place in a lot of settings prior to this recent wave of policies. The trade-off is they don't really meaningfully move the needle. They don't reduce distractions or change school culture. There's high variability, unclear expectations often. It's useful as a supplement. It's unlikely to drive any sort of system level change on their own. Um, and what we've generally found is that implementation, and I'm going to talk about this more when we talk about our case study, implementation seems to be where policies fail or succeed. And that's probably true of most policies. It's especially true of these cell phone policies that have been enacted. And, these are the three main buckets. I will say, I actually was visiting a school in Santa Ana, California, just this past week, where they actually have had a bell-to-bell ban since 2022. So they were far ahead of the curve of the recent wave of policies. But their compromise that they have is that between 10 o'clock and 10:10 a.m. and between 2 o'clock and 2:10, they actually do allow phones for their high schoolers only, not for their middle schoolers. And they understand it's understood and it's widely been understood that at 2:11 your phone will be confiscated, or at 9:59 your phone will be confiscated. But there's these two 10-minute windows throughout the day that they do allow it. It seems to have worked for their context, but I think again that as with all these policies, it's implementation and enforcement and consistency seems to be the key. I'll pass it back to Tim to talk about impacts.
So when it comes to the research, we have to make it sure that it's thrown out there. A lot of research still needs to be done. There is still very limited research on the impact of cell phone bans, mainly because they're fairly new here in the United States. So a lot of the literature out there has been done in Europe, is the main area, and also Australia. When it comes to academic outcomes, this is where the research is pointing to school bans improving academic performance, especially for those in the lower achieving and disadvantaged students groups. This was specifically seen in the United Kingdom in a study that was done there, where they saw an increase of over 6% on the national exam scores for students between the ages of 11 and 16 in 4 English cities. We also saw positive results in Spain, where the regions that adopted cell phone bans had higher scores in math and science than the regions that did not adopt the cell phone bans. One study that has been done here in the United States that is particularly relevant to this webinar here was done in Florida, where they saw improvement in academics, but it was not until the second year. So it did take time. And I think that's very important for us as researchers and practitioners and policymakers to understand that it may not be an immediate advantage or change in academics. It may take an initial year of an adjustment. One study that did find that it did not help academics was done in Sweden, but it is important to note that that study was done prior to the pandemic, which during the pandemic, a lot of students were on technology and learning to use technology even more and more. Now, when it comes to mental health, that's where we're still seeing some mixed results. We have seen in a study in Australia where students have noted a decrease in bullying, but there is limited findings in Australia for decreasing anxiety and depression. And the authors of that study specifically noted that it may be due because students are still using their cell phones outside of school. In another study done in England that banned cell phones during the day, they did not see improvement with anxiety or depression, sleep, or physical activity. When it came to the students' mental health, so again, they led the reason for that finding to be students are still using their cell phones beyond the school day. Now, some studies have found that students are engaging more within the classroom and also outside of the classroom. So a study that was done in New York City with some of the KIPS schools has found that students are actually engaging more with their classmates outside of school. So they saw an increase of student attendance at at sporting events, I should say, based off of their experience of interacting with their peers during the day. Now, one more recent study that came about from this conference that David and I were at this past week was a study done in Connecticut. It's a 3-year longitudinal study. They reported results based off their first year. They focused on using Yondor pouches, which is a form of bell-to-bell ban. Now, they noted that there was no difference in academics, student well-being, or attendance between the schools that used Yondor pouches and those that did not. Now, they did note that sometimes the students did not always lock up their cell phones because it was very hard to manage 800 students locking up their cell phone for all the school administrators and teachers. But they did note that teachers were very much supportive and appreciated the school district purchasing the Yondor pouches as a way to show that their support was there for the initiative. Now I'll throw it back to David to talk more about our study in Virginia.
All right, yeah, I'll wrap up with our case study. We had a sort of a unique opportunity to sort of get ahead of a policy being enacted in July of 2024. Then Governor Glenn Youngkin of Virginia signed an executive order. It's since been codified into law, but signed an executive order banning cell phones bell to bell. Left it to the districts, individually to come up with what that policy looked like, but that was basically prescribed the ends, if you will. So we partnered with the school district in Virginia. Our focus was on teachers. We knew that there were other people who were covering the basis on student outcomes, but we wanted to know how this looked for teachers because they were going to have to be the people enacting on the front lines. They were going to be the frontline enactors of the policy, if you will. So we did surveys and focus groups with teachers both before the policy went into effect and also 3 months into the policy. We chose that point in time because it was just before testing, and we wanted to see what it looked like at that point in time. And basically, what we found is on the front end, about 80% of teachers said that indeed cell phones were a problem in their class, and somewhere around 85% of teachers approved of the policy pre-implementation, which is extremely high. When we look 3 months into implementation, we found that there were still about 80% of teachers supported the policy, and they thought that it was appropriate for their school context. And what we found is the teachers reported significant reductions in classroom distractions and classroom behavior incidents in their class. Maybe the most interesting finding was we had a scale that we created that measures teachers' perceptions of their workload. And although nothing was taken off their plate over the span of these 4 months, teachers reported lower levels of perceived workload after the 3 months into the policy being implemented. And when our focus group findings suggest that that's because they spent less time in their classroom, actually, redirecting students who had their phones out, and they spent more time in actual instruction, actual teaching, which is what they signed up to do in the first place. The one sort of caveat was, again, it comes around implementation and consistency. We also saw a slight reduction in teachers' views of their the colleague support and the support of their peers. And a lot of that was due to, in some contexts, inconsistency, where if you knew that you could go to Miss Smith's class and she would let you take the phone out for the last 10 minutes, that was frustrating to the teacher who was implementing to fidelity and making sure that this policy was carried out all the way. But overall, one of the things that we found in this district that was interesting was it seemed like across the board, administrators were behind it, were behind the ban. They were supportive of teachers, and we really think that made all the difference. So I mean, our main takeaways from here is just implementation matters. You have to implement to fidelity, and administrators need to support teachers in order for this to actually work and move the needle for students. And if to the extent that that doesn't take place, it just puts additional burdens on teachers, which in the end, again, doesn't bode well for the impacts that we want to see in students, the academic and social and otherwise. But those were our main findings that we had from our case study.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pressling, Dr. Marshall. That was exactly what we were hoping for, which was a clear evidence-based presentation. And it's a reminder of why research matters. And it's some of those things that you found as you were, going on about teacher satisfaction and feelings of workload are really interesting potential areas for future research. Well, anytime we do any kind of policy research, it can't be done without the policymakers and legislators who make it possible for this to be enacted. So that brings us to our next two guests, and I invite them to turn their cameras on because research only changes lives when it finds its way into policy. So we are really fortunate to have two enterprising legislators who've done exactly that on this issue, who looked at the evidence and what it was showing, who were listening to parents and teachers and had the courage to act. Senator Chase Blasey is the majority leader of the Kansas Senate. Kansas recently became one of the latest states to enact a bell-to-bell smartphone ban with sequestration, joining a growing national movement that now spans more than 35 states with some form of cell phone ban. Senator Blasey has been a central figure in making it happen, and the fact that Kansas moved as decisively as it did is no small part a reflection of his leadership. Senator Jeff Rotz represents District 27 in the Indiana State Senate. Like Kansas, Indiana implemented a policy that removes phones from student access for the entire school day, not just during class time. Senator Rotz helped lead that effort to strengthen Indiana's already existing approach on this issue. Gentlemen, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We'd like to dig into your experiences. So first, I'll start with a question for you, Senator Blasey. How did you first become engaged on this issue? What was the moment or the moments that made you say this is something you need to act on? And what were the obstacles that you faced on the way in Kansas?
I really got interested in the issue back in 2023, started seeing some states and even Europe start taking action. And then I was fortunate to come across the book Anxious Generation in early 2024 and really just opened my eyes to just the complexity of this actual issue. And, student mental health, student learning, all the things that we've seen grow since COVID has really been something I've been passionate about trying to tackle. And Kansas is one of the states that we have the highest youth suicide rates, and I believe the data shows there's probably a correlation between usage of cell phone use and just the stories I've heard from teachers, parents, and students in the classroom. Actually, in fact, I just had some parents in my office a few months ago during this legislative session explain to me how prevalent suicide is in their school, and their own child admitted it's because of cell phones. They're not talking to each other. And so it just reinforced to me how important this issue really is. And so in 2024, the State School Board of Kansas created a task force of about 35 people, which made up of teachers, parents, students, administrators, school board members, and then a few lawmakers. And I was fortunate to be selected. And we studied this issue very thoroughly throughout the whole year and made a recommendation to the state school board that they ban phones in all schools K through 12. And unfortunately, they decided not to do that. They just recommended it. And I felt like that was not satisfactory. And so I introduced legislation to do that. However, it's taken us a few years to finally see it come to full fruition, where just last month, our governor signed into law a full bell-to-bell ban. It was an issue that our governor is Democratic. I'm Republican. And so it was an issue that crossed party lines. People felt like this was an issue that was not partisan. However, we had people in both parties very strongly opposed the bill for various reasons, but ultimately we had the numbers to push it across the line. The Democratic leader in the Senate actually teamed up with me to sponsor this legislation in the Senate to pass it through. And I think that was critical just because in Kansas, public schools are very strong. People love their public schools in Kansas. We're a populous state from our very beginning, and so they were some of our obstacles were the public schools. Now the teachers, talk to the actual teachers and the administrators, they're really in favor of it. They would kind of say, publicly we want to keep local control, but wink wink, it would help us if you did it. So the parents are mad at you and not us. And so in this legislation, also I pushed very hard. Actually, shockingly, one of the biggest fights for us to pass this bill was my hope to include private schools. And we did include private schools, and it passed and signed into law. But I felt like this issue does not discriminate only for public school kids. It impacts all kids. And so I wanted to see as many kids included. And so including private schools added another 27,000 students into the law. So that was actually the biggest fight. shockingly, was actually the private schools, adding the private schools or not. Just because we've had years of this is our third year of introducing the legislation that's taken us time to actually get folks educated on the issue. As anything with legislation, you plant the seed and it takes time to kind of see it come to fruition. So, but yeah, I would say the data and anxious generation and just studying what other states and countries have done was really what motivated me to act. And being a young father of four sons, it's something I'm very passionate about, ensuring that kids are active outside playing, not sitting inside on screens or phones. And so that is also, I think, a personal motivation for me.
Thank you so much. Senator Rotz, tell us a little bit about your path on this issue. I know Indiana's had a slightly different experience. What gave you and your colleagues the conviction to act and to pass the legislation that you worked on?
Well, thank you, and very similar. I can relate to Senator Blasey on some of the things he mentioned and the pathway to get this thing done. Several years ago, we did ban cell phones during instructional time, and as was mentioned in the study, legislation either wins or loses upon implementation. And that's at the lowest level, right? So at the classroom level, even if the school district was positive about it, what was happening in the classroom was something different. And essentially, I learned that from multiple schools in the last 2 years. And so we brought it up this year again, and nationally, you mentioned a book as well on the anxious generation, which played a part in where we stood on this as well, or where I stood on it to bring it to the table. Essentially, we need better academic outcomes in the classroom. And we also this year banned social media. Well, I shouldn't say banned it. What we did was for those students under the age of 16 had to have parental permission. And we learned a great deal about social media, which I think communicating on cell phones is one thing, but what apps are they utilizing in order to communicate? And so we did both this year. So I thought we went in full speed and we were able to get it done. In fact, the social media bill was completely bipartisan. Cell phone bill, not so much, and pretty much the same as what was spoken about as well. And so originally the academic ban or during instructional time, excuse me, was implemented in one classroom and not another classroom. And so that is really the reason why that we went back at it and said, if we're going to do this thing with integrity, we need to go ahead and just go all the way and get it done. And some of I can tell you, I probably was, got a tongue lashing, I'll put it kindly, from a parent worse than any that I've had yet. And so in the middle of that as well, there was a lot of conversation about what if there's an emergency? I can't get a hold of my child. And we were able to rebuff that. The National Association of School Resource Officers actually said this is the way to go because if students that are underage, especially getting younger ages, need to listen to the instruction to save their lives, and they shouldn't be on their cell phone calling their parents. And so that was a huge feather in our hat fighting this during that time, because that was probably the largest complaint from parents, I'd say. But other than that, again, we got it across the finish line, and there are a lot of, in my opinion, repercussions of not only using a cell phone in the classroom, but certainly utilizing social media in the midst of that. So the two are paired together with a cell phone.
Well, that's really fascinating. The information and experience you had with the national resource officers. Did you seek out that support, or are they tracking this issue separately and wanted to jump in Indiana?
Tracking it separately, and I really didn't engage with them. I got a formal document from them, so they had looked at it across the United States, and that was they had already made the call on their support of bell to bell.
So I have a question because you guys have done the hard lifts and you've given a little indication that one of the worst tongue lashings you had was on this issue, but you've now uh, pushed this through and then also done, work on social media, and you're obviously connected with what Jonathan Haidt's been doing. What kind of responses have you gotten from constituents, and what does that tell you about how this policy is working?
Well, it doesn't go into effect until July 1st, so we have some time before it actually happens. And so in Indiana, we'll pass, and then everything, if not specified, becomes law July 1st or enacted July 1st. So honestly, um, if I were to tell the truth, I'd say because I have some gray hair in my head, maybe I'm thinking incorrectly when we talk about social media and the woes of it, if you will. But I think the statistics are stacked against it. In fact,
Mhm.
the one of the and I can't necessarily say that this is the gospel truth, but at females since 2010, the suicide rate up 65.3%. For males, about 35%. And so, and then we look at the concept of, in fact, Jonathan Haidt in his book kind of affirmed for me that I wasn't thinking wrong necessarily, that because I had gray hair, on how this affects even brain development from the younger ages, whether they're playing games on a device or not. In fact, there's even some uh, uh, sources out there that say we should have books in the classroom and not devices, school
Yeah,
sponsored devices. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's that'll be part of our closing conversation. So I'm glad to hear you kind of seeing some of that same research too. Senator Blasey, since the governor signed the legislation, have you seen any kind of change from the public or any kind of feel? I mean, I realize these things take time to unfurl, but sometimes when you get past these legislative moments, you start to hear from your supporters, or get a different feel once, this legislation's enacted. What kind of responses have you gotten? Anything surprise you?
So, I mean, I've spoken to a lot of groups about this since we've been working on it this last 6 months, and then after its passage. And generally, most people are very supportive, especially adults, older adults. But I do get emails. I think from seniors in high school who might be a government project to email me their opinions on the legislation. And generally, the students are not in favor of it. But like Senator Ratz, I've gotten a few very strongly worded emails from parents who say the government's not going to tell them what to do and how when they can communicate with their child. But I think from what I have found in the few school districts that have already implemented a bell-to-bell policy on their own, they've said it takes about 2 weeks after implementation within the school year. It's a culture change. It's literally a fundamental culture change. I mean, you have students who at one time you had 8 boys sitting at a lunch table not talking to each other, but they're texting each other. And then they said when those phones went away, it was amazing to see these kids flourish and make new friends and talk to people they've never spoken to. And so, in fact, we had one building administrator say fights went down because you didn't have social media and Snapchat and all these things that would start fights in the hallway during passing periods or lunch. And then, one of the criticisms was about safety, right? What are we going to do if there's an active shooter or a fire or something? And we had law enforcement testify in Kansas that said, in fact, these phones are actually a hindrance to law enforcement getting to the building to save your child. It's because every kid's texting or calling their parent, and they come to the school, and it blocks traffic and it blocks emergency services. And so we had a fire recently in one of our schools in Kansas where that happened just last year. And so law enforcement made it very clear that this needs to happen. And so we were very happy to have their support in that endeavor. So, but generally, I would say the community, I mean, this is an issue that everybody has an opinion on, whether you're 12 years old or 80 years old. And so it's an issue that's very interesting that has gotten a lot of people to talk about. But most people that I've encountered have been very supportive.
Great. So we're obviously living in a time, and you both have referenced it a few different times, that things can get pretty partisan for those of you in office and discussions. When you look at the map of states, though, based on our research at Paragon, there's smartphone bans in red states and blue states, Republican governors, Democratic governors, conservative legislators, and progressive ones. but they're all moving in the same direction. And in fact, they seem, according to our analysis nationally, to be going more towards the bell to bell and sequestration. So the later legislation is passed, the more the more limits that are being put on the cell phone use, and the more flourishing that can then be enabled in the schools. So let me just start with you, Senator Rotz. In your experience, why does this issue seem to cut through the partisan divide? Is it the evidence, or is it, you've both mentioned, the rise in suicide rates? Is that what's resonating with parents and the public and voters, or is it something else?
Well, as you mentioned, I think that the story is untold yet, I think, and honestly, and hopefully when we talk about statistics, and even when I mentioned the suicide rate for uh, female teens since 2010, is that the only issue that's caused it to spike? I'm sure there are other things that are part of that, so it's hard to delineate necessarily specifically what the issues are that help with that. And so I too, again, have people that love it and people that incredibly don't like it. But I would suggest even a thought pattern, like you mentioned in the lunchroom, communicating between students, or communication between students. What is it with as we look off into the future and we think about AI and its effect on what and how we do things? Uh, is communication, our communication skills still necessary, and will they still be necessary, and how and when are they taught? As uh, Senator Blasey mentioned in the lunchroom, there was a testimony of, you walk in and there's 300 students in there, it's quiet, and then several weeks later you go in and there's communication going on. And of course, we can argue about the facial expressions and the tone of our voice and how we communicate back and forth. And students need to learn those things, and the earlier the better, right? I like to use the concept of between two boys, one says the wrong thing and he gets, punched in the nose. Well, so he's going to get in trouble for doing it, but he'll learn maybe not to do that. And the other guy maybe will learn, maybe I shouldn't say those type of things. And so there's a lot of things that we do that are displaced, if you will, by social media or cell phones being able to communicate back and forth.
Right. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate your courage, senators. I'd love to invite Dr. Marshall and Dr. Presley back on just for a roundtable discussion. Let me just open it up. You're all experts in your specific fields. Was anything that was said by one of the other panelists something that kind of resonated with you, that was of interest, or that was new? Just you're at the very leading edge, so I want to give an opportunity for you guys to talk amongst yourselves.
I'll actually take that up. I think actually something that Senator Ross just said resonates with me quite a lot. One of the things that I've heard in conversation when I've talked about cell phone bans, especially the bell to bell, is I've had the pushback I've gotten is like, well, come on, David, we're entering this era of AI. You can't be anti-technology in an era that's going to be increasingly driven by technology. And actually, I thought, the conversation actually from both senators, but especially what Senator Ross just said, kind of ties it all together beautifully, especially as kids are developing, especially when they're developing social skills. You're seeing kids start to flourish again in the lunchrooms are louder. People are, as Tim said, we've seen studies where kids are actually choosing to spend time socially with one another, extracurriculars and high school sports at increasing rates after bell-to-bell bans have been implemented. And I think these communication skills are actually going to be what's necessary in the era of AI. These are the things that artificial intelligence and machines are not going to be able to replace. Those who can effectively communicate well, I think, are going to be the ones who succeed. And ironically, I think it is this implementation of a bell-to-bell cell phone ban that is helping to create these skills. And I think that's where I think while it may seem like these things are intention, I think this is actually setting students up for success in the long run.
So I want to invite the audience to throw in their questions for our guests. I would love to hear those. I also have just a roundtable question here. So we've gotten to hear about the research gains for in academic terms and also in behavior. And then I know the senators have heard from real constituents. So I want to ask all of you, beyond the test scores and the discipline metrics, what do you believe children are actually recovering when the cell phone goes away? What is being restored in the classroom, in the hallway, and at lunch that we may have forgotten was missing in the first place?
Well, I'll just start off and say in the classroom, they're able to focus more. Some recent research has found that every time get a phone notification, we lose about 7 seconds. So we're distracted. Going from learning to cell phone to back to learning is costing us our focus, our ability to learn more in depth, which is going to be seen on state standardized tests, which is what we really care about in education these days. So I think just from an academic standpoint is we're able to get students hopefully a little bit more focused when it comes to the classroom. And I think from outside of the classroom, we saw it and heard it from the teachers in our study in Virginia, and the senators kind of mentioned this as interacting with each other. Students are talking to each other in the hallways at lunch instead of just staring down at their phone, sitting by themselves. So I think those are two of the major aspects that students would get back when we see these bell-to-bell bans.
Interesting. So let me ask something that's on minds of a lot of parents who are watching, because the battle over smartphones doesn't begin and end at the schoolhouse door. So you've all been able to think about the broader implications of these issues. What can families do at home? What practical steps do you recommend for parents who want to limit use, who feel their households need a kind of digital detox and want to rebuild the habits of concentration and conversation?
Well, I'll start off quickly. I've heard some testimony of students who have limited time on their phones or don't even have cell phones till a certain age. And we probably all of us on the phone, maybe if you had strict parents or maybe you didn't have the affordability to live a certain way and you didn't kind of stack up to everybody else. And so that's probably problematic in some respects for students anyway. But I would support certain age limits if I were back at it. Now, I have two daughters. One's 31, one's 27, and we restricted the first one longer than the second one, and we have no regrets whatsoever on restricting that use. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, if it affects brain development, we I wouldn't can't imagine, and I would hope Senator Blasey would feel the same way. The state saying kids can't have, devices until they're X. I don't. That's a whole nother issue, I'd say. But I do think we're finding out that the concept of utilizing smartphones or even any electronic device probably alters the brain growth, and at least some of the things I've seen. I'm speaking as a novice, certainly, but there's serious consequences if that's the case. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, Senator Blasey, do you have thoughts, your own reflections on that?
Well, when we actually wrote this bill, we considered putting in a screen time ban on elementary schools, but we thought maybe that might be too comprehensive at this time, and it might actually jeopardize the cell phone ban. So we did not add that portion of the bill. But I do hope that the state taking these actions are making a lot of parents think, why is the state doing this? And maybe they go do their own research and look at the data to see why waiting till 8 is a common lingo people use. Wait till eighth grade. Wait till 8. Maybe parents are going to wait and delay giving their kid a cell phone. My oldest child is 8, almost 9, and I remember coming home from Christmas, first days of Christmas break, and he said that some of his buddies got phones over Christmas. And he goes, "Why can't I have a phone?" And it's like, well, you're in third grade. Why do you need a cell phone? And these are smartphones that these kids have. And so I mean, it's reminded me that this is an issue that we have to educate the public on the data and show how dangerous these things are for young minds. And I think it's my hope that through time, as the states continue to talk about these types of technology and restrictions, that parents are going to want to do their own research and dive into it more because employers are telling us kids are coming out of school and they just cannot have a conversation. Or they struggle with some of the basic um, skills that many people have not had to work on previously because they just had interaction with each other. You see the whole body language, you see conflict resolution. I mean, so often you see keyboard warriors instead of actually having to have conflict with a person. It's not uncomfortable, but you learn these skills through time when you're actually having to talk to somebody. So that's
Right.
what
Professors, do you have any thoughts on that and just kind of where the future of the research seems to be uh, open and ready for more inquiry?
Well, I still would I'd like to dig more into if there's into what the social ramifications are for kids. You know, again, we passed the Focus Act here in Alabama. It went into effect this current school year, and I had a conversation with our current superintendent the second day it was in effect, and she told me she was getting phone calls from all of the principals talking about how loud the lunchrooms were. They weren't used to that, but that was something they were going to welcome, as one of the outgrowths of that. But going back to what Senator Blasey was, invoked mental health and suicidality and depression and some of the mental health outcomes. I mean, if you track Centers for Disease Control data from 2011 2021, is disastrous. The levels that have spiked, particularly among girls, but also boys. Just the numbers that say they have poor mental health, increased, experienced depression, thought about suicide. It's not good, and I think it goes back to the idea of loneliness, which was one of the things that Tim and I did look at. With some of our work, I think that having these pro-social policies where kids are spending more time in conversation with one another, they're making new friends that they were previously might have texted or not texted even. I think that is one of the paths forward to helping the mental health crisis that we've seen over the last decade or more. But again, I said I think, and as a social scientist, I'm trained that after I think something, I should try to find some data to see if the trends I'm thinking about actually bear out.
Right, right. So we have a few questions. Thank you so much for that. We have a few questions from our audience. So you speak of social media bans. How do schools implement a ban of specific apps? Are there any additions to classroom curriculum to teach internet and phone safety, programs to teach parents? So I think there's three questions there, but I invite you all to take out the pieces that stand out to you.
For me, the how the bill landed in Indiana on social media, we set a threshold for revenue, and so if it was actually it was $1 billion, anything above $1 billion, that uh, organization would have to limit young people under the age of 16. That was what we found that was probably one of the better ones. It's still not going to catch everybody. So apps would fall under that essentially when we talk about when I use social media, the concept specifically in the classroom and eliminating usage of apps. I don't know how you actually do that on a cell phone. If the cell phones are in the classroom, school sponsored devices, they can limit access to about anything, and which is a good thing as well. So um, schools that still allow cell phones, I believe in Senator Blasey may think something differently, but if they allow cell phones in their classrooms, there's no way to limit the apps that a student could use.
And the legislation Kansas just passed actually prohibits schools from requiring social media and certain apps to be used because we had parents testify or at least submit testimony that said their child couldn't be the coach of the swim team or tennis team unless I'm sorry, not the coach, the captain of the tennis team, unless they were willing to do the team social media pages, manage them, post on them. And they said, well, our kid doesn't have a cell phone. We don't want our kid to have a cell phone. We don't want our kid to have social media. But they were being forced to force their kids to get social media just to comply with the
Oh,
school requirements so their kid could be a team captain. And so we put in the
interesting.
law that is now illegal. They cannot require that. So it's one way we try to tackle social media just so parents can feel like it's social pressure more than anything.
And I'll take a stab at the curriculum aspect. I think we are entering a time where students do probably need some guidance on how to use and when to use and how to self-regulate with electronics. So if there are ways that schools can help students understand when it's appropriate to use a phone and when it's not, I think that that's going to be very valuable. Obviously, that's going to have to be implemented very carefully in order to make sure these bans don't just go by the wayside, just so we can teach students how to use phones appropriately. I think it's also important, as noted in the question, of teaching parents and all teaching parents about what the outcomes of these using phones and getting notifications are on kids so that they can make the best decisions for themselves, but also just teaching them about why it's important to have these bans in school, and how they might be able to carry them out beyond the school room. So giving them actual strategies they can implement at home to better their kids.
So we have a question here that I'm sure you've gotten in many fora, all of you. I know, Senator Blasey, you had mentioned that you talked a lot about this in public venues, but the question is, how should we balance parental responsibility and liberty with preparing kids for an online future instead of letting politicians impose one-size-fits-all bans and phone bans in schools? And wouldn't school choice be a better way to let parents decide what works best for their own children?
Well, I would say that in our ban in Kansas, we gave a lot of flexibility for school districts to enforce how they're going to discipline, how they're going to enforce discipline, how they're going to enforce the law in general. Because there's certainly a lot of ideas floating around the state house, but we wanted local school districts to be able to decide how to have some flexibility on what best works for them. Now, certainly, there is, I think they call it like good citizenship or something like that, or good stewardship and how to use technology. And I think schools are teaching that. And I don't think having a cell phone ban prohibits or is going to prevent a school from still teaching the responsible use of technology, because we know technology can be dangerous with AI and false images and graphics and sending images. So certainly we want to ensure schools are teaching that, but I don't think having phones out of the classroom is going to hinder that education. And obviously, schools should host, like they do on many other things, host nightly or have one evening host the same thing for parents. And how do you teach parents to be good uses? Because we had a detective testify on the bill in Kansas that said the most dangerous places for kids are their bedroom and the locker room with phones. And that's where predators get into them, where there's no parental eyes, and that's where how they connect with other students and other kids is through the phones, through those two time periods. So I think certainly I don't think banning phones in school are going to put American kids behind China or other countries in terms of technology advancements and creativity. In fact, I'd say it's going to be the opposite. I mean, none of us on this call had smartphones when we were in school, and I think we all probably know how to use one relatively pretty well. So I think the human mind will learn when it needs to learn, but I think focusing on the basics, comprehension, reading, and stuff like that is critical that is being missed because of cell phone use.
Great. Thank you. Um, Senator Rotz, any thoughts from your
Sure.
interactions on this kind of
Yeah,
freedom divide?
could not agree more with Senator Blasio's comment. I, I I where I live geographically is I live about 2 miles from the Ohio line where I live, and so my wife works at Miami University of Ohio, and she was on a at an event where they took some of their brightest students in AI in an AI class, to a board members meeting, and I had to give a talk. I have a Indiana University regional campus in my district. And so she told me, well, these guys were so smart, young people just starting college. And so that's great. Give me the guy's name. I'm going to call him. I'll spend a couple hours with some of these guys and get an idea really on AI and how it affects and that. And very surprisingly, so now we're talking about some enterprising young men that are in college and they're academic. Maybe they're partying at night. I don't know, but they were pretty bright students. At any rate, they mentioned that the social aspect of students, especially in the elementary, I'll never forget that they mentioned this. They don't need cell phones. They need to learn to socially interact. And so we talk about all these things. And again, I would bring you back to the point of gray hair and growing up and, going away and then coming back at the end of the day, or when mom said you had to be back and grew up in the country. There are aspects I think we're missing if we don't do some of these things and help these. There's a certain way things are done. And I'm not certain cell phones or included with social media do well at all. And unfortunately, I'd even say that I recall being in a machine shop with young people, and they do something, they pick up their phone and look at it quick, and then do something else. Got to pick the phone up and see who's saying what or whatever. I think we're on the right pathway here.
Well, Dr. Marshall, Dr. Presley, Senator Blasey, Senator Rotz, thank you so much for your time and your research and your leadership. I want to be mindful of your time, and we hope we'll stay in contact with all of you and get to hear about where you think this research is going and where your leadership is going to be taking us on screens and digital hygiene. So on behalf of everyone at Paragon Health Institute, we thank you, and we hope this conversation has been useful for our audience, and we hope you'll stay engaged with this issue because the research is clear and the momentum we think is really real, as you can see, and that children in our schools are counting on us to get this right. We'll be having a forthcoming request for research on technology and kids to build on this smartphone paper and the tremendous reception it's had. And we hope that you'll look and direct folks towards it so that we can get more quality research out there on these issues. And we hope you will join us in this effort to advance public health and American well-being. Thank you very much for your time, and have a great day.